You were never supposed to hear this. Behind the stone walls of St. Mary's Convent, the silence wasn't sacred. It was strategic. Between 1854 and 1862, 23 women, daughters of God, cloaked in black habits, vanished without trace. No graves, no records, no answers. Just the hollow echo of prayers recited by fewer and fewer voices. The Catholic Church says it's nothing. A clerical error. Misfiled transfers. But sealed within the walls of a forgotten Wisconsin mansion, discovered only by accident during renovations, was a diary so precise, so damning that even Vatican archivists tried to purchase it before it ever reached the public. Tonight, you step behind the veil. What you're about to witness is not myth. It's history scrubbed, rewritten, and buried beneath centuries of incense and gold leaf. This isn't about faith, it's about power. Institutional rot dressed as righteousness. You're not watching a story unfold. You're walking into the inner sanctum, into a place where obedience wasn't holiness. It was leverage, and those who resisted were erased. So listen carefully, because this isn't a ghost story. This is a ledger of human sacrifice dressed in ritual. The spire of St. Mary still cuts the horizon above Lake Michigan. You can stand in its shadow. But you will not see the truth with your eyes. You must feel it in your gut, where ancient fears sleep, where ancestral memory remembers what was done in stone cloisters under the guise of salvation. The church won't speak of it. The locals pretend it never happened. But you're here now, and you're going to learn what it costs to make angels disappear. By the end of this story, you will not be the same, because truth, real truth, burns. Let's begin at the hour of matins, when the first scream was heard and immediately swallowed by sacred stone, a sound no one ever admitted to hearing, a sound that marked the beginning of the unraveling. You'll hear it too, before this is over. Now ask yourself, why would an institution built on salvation trade in silence, shame, and the systematic removal of its most obedient daughters? You're not ready, but you're here, and that's enough for now. The stone chapel was still dark when the first cry echoed. Thin, sharp, quickly choked off. It was winter 1856. Snow covered the convent grounds like a burial shroud, and the wind off Lake Michigan howled like a warning. Inside, the nuns gathered for matins. 20 women stood where 21 should have been. No one spoke. Not even when Sister Mary Collins' lips trembled. Sister Josephine Brady was gone. No announcement this time. No fabricated mission. Just her empty cot. Her rosary beads still looped neatly over the headboard. Her journal missing. Her shoes still beneath the bed. And on the wooden floor, a single drop of something dark, soaked into the grain. Mother Catherine said nothing. She stood at the altar, arms raised in prayer, her voice low and unwavering. Deliver us from temptation, she intuned, and preserve us in purity. Sister Margaret crossed herself with steady hands. Sister Elizabeth's eyes never left the floor. Whatever had happened, it wasn't an accident. It was understood now. When a nun disappeared, the proper response was devotion, not inquiry. Behind the curtain of ritual, something had shifted. The air had teeth. The following morning, the nuns were roused at 20:30 a.m., earlier than usual. Penance will be extended today. Mother Catherine announced, her voice like stone dragged across stone. For impurity in thought, for failure in trust, for the weakness that invites darkness. No one dared ask what she meant. The chapel was colder than usual. Candles were dim. And the hymn chosen was Dies Irae, Day of Wrath. By spring, the rhythm of the convent had turned from discipline to domination. Meals were reduced, baths restricted. The infirmary, once a sanctuary, was locked to all but Sister Margaret. The laughter of children in the orphanage, gone. The bell tower told with grim finality. And yet, letters from the diocese praised the community. Exceptional discipline, they said. Devout sacrifice. Donors doubled their offerings. The bishop commended Mother Catherine for her iron devotion in a time of moral decay. But those who lived inside the limestone walls knew something else. The convent was becoming a cage, and the rules were changing. Why? Because silence is a system. Disappearance is doctrine. And once a pattern becomes holy, it can hide anything, even blood. You're starting to see it now, aren't you? They weren't transferred, they were taken. By midsummer of 1856, the walls of St. Mary's no longer whispered, they listened. The younger nuns had learned to sleep with one ear open, to pray with eyes cast downward, to eat in silence even sharper than their hunger. There was a new presence in the convent, not a person, but a pattern, a method, a tightening grip, and the more devout the sister, the more likely she was to disappear. Sister Mary Collins began keeping count in secret, not just of the missing, 5 by then, but of the times Mother Catherine stood motionless in the garden at dusk, her pale eyes fixed on something beyond the trees, of the sounds at night, wood groaning, quick footsteps, a door bolt sliding into place, of the orphanage children waking with nosebleeds and no memory of dreams, of Sister Margaret's bitter herbal concoctions growing darker in color, thicker in texture, stranger in scent. One evening, Mary found a folded scrap of parchment tucked into her worn psalter. 6 words written in a rushed, unfamiliar hand. She drinks from the black chalice. That night she didn't sleep. What Mary did not know, what she would not discover until far too late, was that the convent's founding structure, the old stone mansion acquired by the church, had a cellar that predated it by nearly 50 years. A crypt, according to local legend. A burial vault, some said, built by the lumber baron who'd vanished without explanation in 1804. The blueprints had been altered, records erased, but the passageway still existed, sealed beneath the east wing, under what was now the nuns' dormitory. And once each month, when the moon reached its blackest phase, someone or something passed through it. The church said nothing. The bishop visited less. Letters from families in Ireland were returned unopened or answered with brief notes in language that felt too formal to be real. Even handwriting seemed altered, eerily consistent across multiple names, and still the work continued. Prayer, penance, service. The mechanisms of faith marching on in the shadow of something deeper, older, and unspeakable. This was not a convent anymore. It was a funnel. A system for selecting souls too pure, too obedient, too untouched by corruption. The perfect offerings. Why? Because in institutions ruled by silence and ritual, sacrifice isn't a mistake. It's tradition. And when tradition turns black, the most faithful are always the first to bleed. They say Mother Catherine never raised her voice. She didn't need to. Her authority was not loud. It was absolute. She spoke softly, and the air changed. Her presence could hollow a room. Her pale blue eyes, so striking on the day of consecration, now seemed to pierce through thought itself. To look at her for too long was to feel your convictions dissolve into obedience. Even the older sisters, Sister Margaret, Sister Elizabeth, lowered their gaze when addressed. But Sister Theresa Donovan was different. Raised on a rocky Irish farm, she had shoveled more dirt and buried more dead by age 13 than most men would in a lifetime. Her faith was unshackable, her back unbowed. And as the disappearances mounted, it was Theresa who began to speak quietly with the remaining sisters during chores, during garden duty, during moments when Mother Catherine wasn't watching. Her questions weren't radical, just clear. Where did Sister Fiona go? Why did Sister Josephine's name vanish from the prayer board overnight? Why do we never hear from the bishop anymore? Except through her. Mary Collins warned her to stop. It's not safe. You don't know what's listening, she whispered one night, but Theresa only shook her head. God listens too. That week, Theresa stopped receiving communion, a small thing easily missed. But at St. Mary's, everything had meaning. Then the infirmary door was locked to her. Then her work was reassigned. Then came the disciplinary silence, a punishment where no nun was permitted to speak to her, look at her, acknowledge her presence in any way. For 7 days, Theresa existed as a ghost among the living. And on the 8th morning, she was gone. No announcement, no mission, no farewell, just her boots, still wet from the storm, by the chapel door. But someone had made a mistake this time. A journal, hidden beneath the floorboard, beneath Theresa's cot, scribbled with entries. And on the final page, just 5 words, They are not in heaven. Mary Collins wept when she read it, but not from sorrow, from recognition, because deep down every sister knew. The orphanage hadn't grown. The infirmary held no new names. The garden produced herbs never seen in Scripture. So where were the missing nuns? You're beginning to understand. This wasn't a series of isolated events. It was a program. And the harvest had only just begun. The first nun to return came back barefoot. It was October 1856. A sharp wind cut across the convent grounds, and frost had already begun to cling to the chapel windows. Morning prayers had just ended when a scream rose from the garden wall. Not a shriek of fear, but something worse. Recognition. Sister Mary Collins was the first to run. There, by the east garden gate, half naked, caked in mud and blood, stood Sister Fiona McGrath, or what was left of her. Her veil was gone, her habit shredded, her skin pale, blistered, frostbitten places. Her lips were cracked, her eyes vacant. One of her fingernails was missing. She held a piece of her rosary, twisted and knotted like it had been yanked violently from her neck. Sister Elizabeth dropped her basket. "Fiona," she whispered. But Fiona didn't speak. She collapsed. They carried her to the infirmary. Sister Margaret tried to block the door, but Mary pushed past her. What she saw inside froze the blood in her veins. Sister Fiona was strapped to the infirmary table, arms trembling, whispering Latin over and over again, but not prayers. Words from older texts, darker ones. Que semel data, numquam recipiter. That which is once given is never taken back. Her voice rose into a shrill chant before collapsing into sobs. Then silence. Then a whisper, "The chalice is not for wine." A Mother Catherine arrived moments later, calm, serene, terrifying. She was found in the forest, she told the gathered sisters. Delirious. Speaking nonsense. She wandered from her assigned mission and endured great hardship. With rest and prayer, she may recover. But she never did. That night, 2 nuns were posted outside the infirmary. By dawn, the bed was empty, the restraints torn, and Fiona McGrath was never seen again. In the garden where she first appeared, Sister Mary found something half, buried under frost, a linen scapular, folded precisely, with a smear of blood on one corner, and a single word sewn into the hem, sacrificium. It was no longer about disappearances. That was too clean a word, too simple. This was about what was being done to the ones who stayed, what they were being prepared for, what they were being offered to. The church had cloaked it in virtue, but what stirred beneath St. Mary's wasn't divine. It was older, and it was hungry. In every system of power, there is a room no one speaks of. At St. Mary's, that room was beneath the east wing. The official layout of the convent listed no sublevels, no catacombs, no storage beneath the dormitories. Yet the stone foundation had inconsistencies, uneven settling, strange heat during winter, whispers through the floorboards. And then there was the sound faint, rhythmic, metallic, like chains. Always just after midnight, always from below. Sister Mary Collins couldn't ignore it anymore. She began her search during assigned laundry duties, where steam masked footsteps and linen carts muffled movement. A loose tile behind the east stairwell revealed a sliver of rotted wood beneath. She pried it up one morning in secret, fingers trembling. A hatch. Beneath it, a stone staircase spiraling into darkness. She returned that night, alone with a candle. The descent was colder than expected. The air turned damp, the smell earth and iron. After 15 steps, she reached the bottom. What she saw was not a storage room. It was a chamber, circular, 10 feet across. Carved symbols lined the walls. None she recognized. Not Latin. Older, the floor was stained, not just from water, but something darker, something that hadn't dried evenly. In the center, a stone basin, waist high, carved with 2 words. Cor et obedientia. Heart and obedience. Beside it sat what looked like a worn leather-bound book. But when she opened it, she recoiled. It wasn't a book, it was a ledger. Names, dates, conditions, all written in the same hand, sharp, angular, elegant. Agnes O'Connor, docile. Faithful Bernard at Walsh, meek. Isolated Fiona McGrath, resistant. Taken early Josephine Brady, quiet. Ideal vessel, each name followed by a red mark. each followed by the word delivered. Mary felt her knees buckle. Because there, at the bottom of the most recent page, was her own name, Mary Collins, observant, devout, unbroken, no date, no mark, just a blank space waiting. Behind her, something moved. She spun, candle shaking, but there was nothing. She fled, heart pounding. The hatch sealed behind her with a hollow thud. That night, Mother Catherine stood at the chapel altar longer than usual. The candles flickered, though no wind stirred. And as the sisters filed out, she turned slowly to face them. "We must prepare," she said softly. "The veil is thinning." They thought she meant All Saints' Day. She didn't. The veil she spoke of was much older, and once it tore, no prayer would stitch it closed again. There comes a moment in every hidden system when the illusion begins to crack. Not all at once, but in small, undeniable ways. For the nuns of St. Mary's, that moment came with the eyes of the children. It was November now. The frost had hardened into ice. The gardens were dead, and the orphanage's narrow windows always seemed to rattle with unseen hands. But it was the children, once bright, playful, occasionally mischievous, who had changed most. They stopped playing. They stopped speaking. They began to stare at walls, at corners, at nothing. Their drawings, once full of trees and saints and childish depictions of the Virgin, now showed dark figures in cloaks. Circles, triangles within circles, a tower with a split crown. One child drew a woman without eyes. Another scrawled a phrase over and over. She watches. She waits. She drinks. Sister Elizabeth tried to hide the drawings, burned them in the chapel furnace when no one was looking. But Mary saw. And she wasn't the only one. Sister Margaret had taken to walking the halls at night with a small iron key around her neck. The infirmary door now required it. No one else was permitted entry, not even in emergencies. Not even when Sister Lucia fell ill with fever and was left moaning behind a locked door for hours before suddenly, inexplicably, falling silent. The next morning, she was gone. Another reassignment, another lie. But Mary no longer needed to be convinced. She'd seen the ledger. She'd heard the sounds beneath the floor. She'd read the last journal entry of Sister Theresa Donovan. They are not in heaven. And now the children, the innocent, the uncorrupted, were no longer safe. Not because of illness, but because they saw too much, felt too much. In places where the veil thins, even a child's silence can become a warning. Mary confronted Sister Elizabeth in the cloister corridor that week. Whispered, "What's happening to them?" Elizabeth only blinked, her voice low. "Cold? They've been chosen. Same as us, duh. What for?" Elizabeth paused. Her eyes, once kind, had gone vacant. "To feed something old." The words hit Mary like ice water. Because she understood, finally, what the ledger really was. Not a record. A menu. And the longer she stayed at St. Mary's, the more likely her name would be next. You don't escape from systems like this by running. You escape by breaking them. But to break a thing like this, you first have to descend all the way into its heart. In December of 1856, Sister Mary Collins stopped praying. Not out of rebellion, not out of disbelief, but because she realized the prayers weren't being heard. Not by God, not by any force of light or mercy. The words they chanted daily, the Latin Psalms, the Hail Marys, the chants of suffering and surrender, weren't rising. They were feeding something in the stone, something below the floorboards. Every whispered plea for salvation, every song of self-denial had become fuel. The convent had been constructed not just on stolen land, but over a forgotten altar. A site of blood devotion, pagan pre-Christian pre-language. She remembered the basin in the chamber, the carvings, the warmth radiating up through the stone during winter, the smell of iron in the air after Mass. This was not a house of God. It was a battery. And the sisters, faithful, obedient, devout were its power source, began to count the bells differently. Not 7 prayers a day, but 7 extractions. The timing was too perfect. The chanting too rhythmic. The weight in the air after each service was not peace. It was hunger-sated. One night, during Compline, Sister Mary looked up instead of down. She scanned the choir stalls. 19 black veils. but only 14 familiar faces. The others had changed. Their skin was pale, almost gray beneath candlelight. Their eyes glassy, movements mechanical. These were not the same women who had arrived from Ireland weeping for home. These were shells hollowed, filled with something else. And then there was Mother Catherine. That night, she did not kneel at the altar. She stood before the crucifix. Back straight, hands raised, not in prayer, but in invocation. Her voice was low, guttural, speaking not Latin, not English, but an older tongue, one that made Mary's teeth ache to hear. And the crucifix, solid oak and iron, trembled. The sisters didn't flinch, they swayed. Mary barely made it back to her cot before vomiting. Her vision blurred. Her heartbeat thundered. She knew then this was not about God. Not anymore, if it ever had been. St. Mary's was a machine, and whatever it had been built to awaken was almost fully fed. You think you'd be different? That you'd run? No, you'd stay. Like they did. Out of duty, out of fear, out of faith. And step by step, you'd disappear, not all at once, but piece by holy piece. By the first frost of 1857, Sister Mary Collins began hearing her own name whispered through the walls. Not shouted, not spoken. Whispered. Always from just beyond the edge of light. Behind doors that should have been locked. In corridors she'd already passed. The voice was always the same, gentle female, but not human. It said her name like a possession, like something already claimed. Mary. At first, she believed it was her imagination, fatigue, malnutrition, the effects of constant fear. But then Sister Clare heard it too. One night, as they scrubbed the chapel floor in silence, Clare's rag stopped mid-stroke. She went pale. I heard it, she whispered. What? It said your name. The next morning, Clare was gone. The ledger updated itself. Mary knew because she checked. There was no pen, no ink. And yet new entries appeared. Handwriting identical, precise. Claire Duval skeptical, weekly anchored delivered. The book was alive. And it wasn't written by the sisters. It was written through them. In the old rituals, those buried before the church swallowed the ancient rites, there were practices for making vessels of the pure, not for possession, but for transformation, to create new forms, flesh tombs, hosts for the invisible hunger, and Mary began to see the pattern. The prayers weren't meant to save. The discipline wasn't about holiness. The disappearances weren't cover-ups. They were metamorphoses. And not all were failing. Some, like Sister Margaret, had completed the passage. She no longer blinked. Her skin was tight waxen. She moved with unnatural stillness. Once Mary saw her fingers bend backward while preparing medicine and snap back without reaction. She tried to tell Sister Elizabeth. Elizabeth only said, "We are clay in God's hands." But Mary had seen what hands stirred this place, and it wore no crown of thorns. That week, while collecting scraps from the convent library, she found a loose stone behind the bookshelf. Behind it, a parchment, aged and brittle, written in both Latin and an older tongue. She could only translate a few lines, but the meaning was unmistakable. To build a throne of flesh, first hollow the choir. To awaken the ancient hunger. Consecrate obedience and fear. She nearly screamed. This wasn't possession, it was a harvest model. And the church hadn't just permitted it, it had designed it. That's exactly how they've survived. Hidden beneath symbols you trust, rites you revere. They've always known. By Epiphany of 1857, the convent bells no longer rang for prayer. They rang for selection. The sisters hadn't been told. No announcement, no new rule. But Mary felt the shift deep in her bones. The sound had changed. It was more than tone, it was intent. When the bells rang now, the sisters moved with a strange lethargy, as if drawn by something heavier than faith. Some blinked more slowly. Some murmured verses that didn't appear in scripture. Others just stared. That January, Sister Helena began to bleed from her ears during morning devotions. She collapsed mid-chant. Her eyes rolled back in her head, and she whispered one word as she convulsed on the chapel floor. Worm. They carried her to the infirmary. She never came out. The next day, her name was gone from the roster, but that wasn't the worst of it. That week, Mary snuck back into the hidden chamber beneath the east wing. She brought oil and matches, intending to burn the ledger, to destroy the root of whatever was feeding the evil here. But the ledger was gone. In its place was a new object, a chalice. Stone, black as obsidian, smooth and cold as death. Carved into its base were the same words she had once seen on the basin. Cor et obedientia. She didn't touch it. She didn't need to. Because beside it lay something worse, Sister Helena's crucifix, warped and cracked, still glinting with fresh blood. Mary backed away, hard hammering. As she turned to leave, she saw something written across the far wall in what looked like charcoal, or ash, or something far darker. Not all thrones are built above ground. That night, during final prayers, Mother Catherine stood before the altar wearing red, a color never used at St. Mary's. Her voice carried deeper than it ever had before. Each word echoed like it was being spoken from beneath the floor itself. She didn't say, Amen, at the end. She said, It is ready. And in that moment, something changed in the air. A pressure, a presence. Like an unseen eye had opened. Mary couldn't sleep. She sat in her cot, fully dressed, clutching a rosary she no longer believed would save her. The silence of the convent pulsed like a living thing. Then just before midnight the bell rang. Once, slow, hollow, a signal. And 13 sisters rose in unison, no hesitation, no word spoken, and walked silently toward the east wing. She followed. She had to know. Because this was no longer about escape. It was about witnessing what was coming. And you, if you're still watching, need to remember this. The systems that enslave you never show their true face until it's too late. And when they do, they don't ask for your belief. The East Wing corridor had always been cold, but that night it breathed. Mary pressed herself against the stone wall, hidden in the shadows, watching the line of veiled sisters file down the hallway in perfect rhythm. Like processional lambs, their footsteps didn't echo. Their heads were bowed, not in prayer, but in submission. She followed at a distance, the hem of her habit dragging silently behind her. They passed the linen room, the old infirmary door, and then stopped before a wall that, to anyone else, was unremarkable stone. But one of the sisters stepped forward, Sister Margaret. Without a word, she pressed her hand against a carved knot in the stone. A groan sounded from behind the wall, deep and mechanical, like the breath of something ancient. Then, with a sound like cracking bone, the wall opened. Mary nearly cried out. It wasn't a passage. It was a throat. A narrow stairwell spiraled down, cut into the rock, steep and wet. The air that came up was thick with rotten incense. It smelled of old blood and burned flowers. The sisters began descending, one by one, without light, without question. Mary hesitated, but something inside her moved. Not fear, something sharper, rage. She stepped into the opening. Down, down. The stairwell tightened with each turn. She passed symbols carved into the wall, sigils older than Christ, older than words. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just a descent into stone. It was a descent into design. After what felt like an hour, she reached a vault. Massive. Circular. Lit by sconces that burned without smoke. At its center stood an altar. Black angular, not made by any craftsman's hand. Around it, the 13 sisters stood in a ring, heads still bowed. Their lips moved, but no sound came. Behind them stood Mother Catherine. She was smiling. She held the chalice. And she was not alone. From the far wall, a shape began to emerge, not walking, unfolding. Thin limbs, backward, jointed. A torso too long, a head that seemed to flicker in and out of dimension, had no eyes, only a mouth, wide, grinning. Mary froze. Her heart stopped, and then Mother Catherine spoke. We do not worship it. We serve it, because it came before worship. The thing moved toward the altar. The sisters didn't flinch. Mary stumbled backward, hitting stone. One of the sisters turned. It was Sister Agnes, but her face was no longer hers, and she smiled, not in recognition, in invitation. You still think faith is light. You've never seen what it looks like when the dark demands devotion. It was bone, compressed, carved, and polished until it gleamed like obsidian. Mary saw it clearly now as the thing, That shape moved closer, its limbs clicking with an insectoid rhythm, head twitching like a marionette with too many strings. It circled the sisters slowly, and though it made no sound, each woman shuddered as it passed. Their eyes rolled back. Their mouths twitched in silent ecstasy. They were no longer nuns, they were keys, each one a sigil carved in flesh. A lock broken open, a vessel reversed. Mother Catherine stood at the altar, her hands raised, the chalice before her. She began to speak, but the words were not hers. Her voice split, layered, one tone low and human, the other not. It rumbled up from the floor, a language of angles, a syntax not meant for the throat. And the chalice responded. It began to fill, not with wine, with blood. Mary watched in horror as a thin stream of crimson poured upward from the altar itself. Defying gravity, reality, feeding the vessel as if wrung from the walls, it shimmered with warmth. Too fresh, too alive, and then she understood. This was no reenactment. This was a transaction. Every disappearance, every fever, every unannounced mission. This was where they ended. Not buried, not lost. Poured, offered. The thing behind the altar moved closer. Its skin, if it could be called that, was translucent, quivering. Inside, things moved, twitched, screamed. It knelt, or folded, or collapsed into itself. And when its head reached the chalice, drank slowly, deliberately. The torches dimmed, the air grew thick, and the sisters began to chant. Mary's body screamed to run, but her mind was entranced. It was beautiful, in the way a thunderstorm is beautiful, in the way the void is beautiful, in the way total surrender is beautiful. She could feel it. The pull, the temptation to join the circle, to let go, to belong. Then she saw it. Beneath the altar, half buried in the dark stone, lay something impossible, the crucifix of Sister Theresa. Broken, burned, but still whole enough to recognize. Beside it, Sister Agnes' rosary, and farther still, a braid of red hair, Sister Bernadette's. They had never left. They had become the sacrifice. Mary bit her lip until blood filled her mouth. It grounded her. She backed away from the chamber's edge, heart pounding like war drums, because now she knew. This wasn't a religion. It was agriculture, and the soil of St. Mary's had been tilled with faith and fear for far too long. She had seen the harvest. It is a dangerous thing to wake up in the middle of a ritual, to realize too late that your entire life was preparation for someone else's feast. Mary didn't sleep that night. She couldn't. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the thing's mouth, wet, grinning, wide enough to swallow a soul. It hadn't just drunk the blood. It had savored it. And the sisters, they'd looked on in reverence. Not fear, not confusion. Reverence. She spent the hours before dawn pacing the dormitory hallway, mind racing. She could no longer pretend, could no longer hide behind piety or protocol. She was inside a weapon, and it was nearly ready to fire when the morning bell rang. Thin, hollow, echoing like bone dropped into a well. Mary didn't move. She stayed in the shadows, watching the others rise and dress. Mechanical, obedient, programmed. But one sister hesitated, Sister Ruth. She was young, newer than most. Transferred from a Detroit parish only 3 months prior. She still cried at night, still kept a small charm from her mother hidden under her mattress. Mary had once helped her bandage a blister without reporting it. A small kindness. That morning, as Ruth knelt in the chapel, Mary saw her hand trembling. After the first chant, she slipped into the corridor and found her. Cornered her gently. Whispered, "You've seen it too." Ruth's eyes filled instantly. She nodded. Mary grabbed her wrist. "We don't have time. If we move before nightfall, we can make the train at Schellsburg. It's a full day's walk through the forest. But if we wait, we vanish like the others." Ruth didn't speak, just nodded again. By mid-afternoon, Mary had stolen 2 cloaks, enough dried bread for a night, and a map drawn on the back of a hymn. They slipped away during the hour of recreation, if you could still call it that. No one laughed anymore. No one even looked up. The gate creaked. No one followed. For a brief moment, the wind off Lake Michigan felt like salvation. But then the bell rang. Not the prayer bell. The other one. The one with no official name. The one that sounded when they knew. The woods turned silent. Birds gone. Branches stiff. Ruth clutched Mary's arm. They're coming. Mary didn't respond, because she already knew. You don't escape systems like this by running. You escape by exposing them. And for that, she'd need proof. She didn't know it yet, but this escape attempt was already doomed. What mattered now was what she brought back. Not physically, at first. The trees still stood where they always had. The path still curved toward Schulzberg like the map had promised. But something in the light began to shift. The way it hit the bark. The way it disappeared too quickly behind them. By the time the sun began to set, the silence was unbearable. No birds. No insects. Not even the wind. Just footsteps. 2 pairs. And then one. Mary turned. Ruth was gone. No scream, no footsteps. Just gone, as if plucked from existence like a thread snipped from fabric. Mary froze. Her lungs refused to move. She called her name once, twice, nothing. Only the silence answering back. Then she saw it, etched into the bark of a nearby pine, not carved, branded, a symbol, a circle. Inside it, an inverted chalice. Above it, a crown made of thorns, split in 2. She staggered back. Her breath formed clouds, though it wasn't cold. The air had thickened. The forest had tilted. And that's when she understood the forest wasn't outside the convent. The convent was inside the forest. And the forest was a containment field. A perimeter? A cage. Not to keep things out, but to keep them in. She turned to run and stop. Mother Catherine was standing 20 feet ahead, beneath the trees, hands folded neatly, eyes aglow in the failing light. No torch, no companions. Just her, still smiling. You broke the rhythm, Sister Mary, she said calmly, as if discussing kitchen duty. You stepped outside the pattern. That's not allowed. Mary backed away. Where's Ruth? Mother Catherine tilted her head. A question you should have asked the moment you arrived here. Where did any of them go? And then, as she took a step forward, her feet didn't make a sound. The leaves beneath her bent, didn't crack. She wasn't walking. She was gliding. Mary ran. Branches clawed at her face, tore her habit, cut her hands. The trees closed tighter, the symbols more frequent, seared into bark and stone like warnings she couldn't read. She didn't stop until she reached the old rail line, abandoned, rusted, but real. She collapsed beside the track, lungs burning, blood dripping from her fingers. Behind her, the forest waited. It didn't chase. It didn't need to, because it had marked her. And now she carried it back into the world. They found her at dawn, curled beside the rusted rail, hands scraped raw, feet blistered, eyes wide open but seeing nothing. Local authorities assumed exposure. A runaway nun half mad from cold and trauma. She was taken to a parish hospital in Dubuque, Iowa. No identification, no shoes. Just a broken rosary wrapped tightly around her wrist, its beads embedded into the skin, as if she'd clung to it through a storm. For days, she didn't speak. Doctors called it shock. Priests called it spiritual distress. But late on the 5th night, she whispered one word to the nurse on duty, buried. The nurse leaned in. What was buried's sister? Mary turned her head, eye sharp now, terrifyingly lucid. That night a priest visited her. Father Donnelly, young, ambitious, newly assigned. He brought flowers and warm words. He asked gentle questions. But Mary only stared, until he reached into his satchel and pulled out a book. Leather, bound worn, familiar, the ledger. Her blood ran cold. You recognize it, he said. Mary didn't move. He opened it slowly. Blank pages. Curious, he said. The bishop's archive said this was used at St. Mary's during your time there. Funny, though, the records say no such person as Sister Mary Collins was ever assigned to the convent. She said nothing. He smiled. I think you've seen too much. I think you wandered too close to things buried under the wrong names. And now you're trying to reassemble what we spent centuries dismantling. He leaned in. You don't understand what was contained there, sister. That wasn't a convent. It was a seal. You broke it. Now we have to decide if you can be resealed. Mary's mouth twitched. For a moment, just a moment, she almost smiled. Then she said softly, You're not the only one with a key. and she reached under the bed. They never found what happened next. Only a blood-soaked ledger in the hospital chapel. Pages full now. Handwritten, dated, accurate. Every missing sister's name, every ritual, every offering. And at the bottom of the last page, one final entry in fresh ink. The soil remembers. The hospital burned that night. The fire started in the chapel. No survivors, only ash, melted icons, and a single crucifix left upright in the rubble, untouched by flame. This wasn't over. This was the beginning. Because St. Mary's was just one garden. Ash spreads faster than truth. The church blamed the fire on faulty wiring, though the hospital had been candle lit. The local paper ran a single column, buried beneath livestock prices and weather forecasts. No mention of Sister Mary, no mention of the ledger, no mention of the chapel. But word traveled elsewhere. Not publicly, not loudly, through whispers, letters. Confessionals where even priests trembled behind the grate. Across the Midwest, in pockets of old faith and older secrets, doors began to shut earlier. Certain names were no longer spoken. And within the Vatican's shadow archives, the section never digitized, never cataloged, an old file was quietly reopened. St. Mary's Convent Site A19, status breached. Immediate containment required. Mary didn't die in the fire. You know this already. Because if she had, the flames would have taken the ledger, and the ledger still moves. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, physically. From parish to parish, from forgotten chapel basements to private libraries of excommunicated scholars. No one keeps it long, not because they don't want to, because it won't let them. Those who've tried to destroy it report the same dream, over and over again. The sound of bells, a forest that breathes, a chalice filling with blood drop by drop, then waking up with hands stained red and pages missing from their Bible. The ledger does not record events, it replays them. Each reading is an invitation. Each name inside is a doorway. The rituals, dormant but not dead, can be triggered again. And they are, in places you'd never suspect. Orphanages, retreat centers, private boarding schools that lost funding, but still pay their groundskeepers. Each one with the same bones beneath the floor. Each one with bells that only ring at night. The soil was never salted. It was seeded. You still think this is Catholic history. You don't understand. The church was simply a vessel, useful, obedient, hungry for order. The thing it served, the thing that stood behind Mother Catherine, behind the altar, behind the chalice, was older than Rome, older than language, older than guilt itself. Mary knew this, and she knew what had to come next. Not faith, fire. Because some systems can't be escaped. They have to be dismantled. And to do that, you don't need an army. You need someone who's seen the inside. The ledger resurfaced in 1962, not in a convent, not in a Vatican archive, in the basement of a private Jesuit high school in Baltimore. Locked in a trunk with no key, no origin, and no explanation for how it got there. The janitor who found it quit the same night. The headmaster refused to speak of it. But one student, 17 years old, a seminarian in training named Daniel Graves, opened it. He didn't sleep for 9 days. When they found him, he was kneeling in the chapel, face pale, lips cracked, eyes staring at the tabernacle as if waiting for it to open. He had written something in the margins of every single page in the ledger. Words in Latin, Greek, and something else. Something no one could translate. One phrase kept repeating, corpus jurum, templum ius. Their body is his temple. He was institutionalized, diagnosed with religious mania. But before his transfer, he told the school's confessor something that was never put in writing, only whispered years later by a guilt-ridden nurse. The sisters are not gone. They're buried alive in the memory of the church. They sing beneath the stone. And he was right, because that's what St. Mary's was. Not just a convent, not just a site of horror. It was an archive of obedience, designed to test how far loyalty could be pushed before the soul fractured. And for some, it never did. Mary saw this. In the weeks after the hospital fire, she disappeared into the system. No formal records, but sightings. Yes, a woman in black visiting shuttered rectories in Pennsylvania. a stranger who left bundles of burned rosaries on the steps of Jesuit seminaries, a name that began to appear in Vatican incident memos. Collins, status interfering agent. Interfering. That's what they call someone who tries to pull up roots. Because St. Mary's wasn't the only seed. There were 33 sites across North America alone, each hidden in plain sight, each with its own ritual calendar, each with a ledger of its own. And Mary, they say, made it her life's work to hunt them, to map them, to expose them. But she couldn't stop what had already been awakened. Because once a ritual reaches recognition, it doesn't need officiants anymore, just observers. That's why you're here. This video isn't entertainment, it's participation. The moment your eyes scanned these words, the system saw you, measured you, logged you. So now, choose, close your eyes, or write this in the comments twice to mark the fracture. The veil is memory. The altar is still warm. Let them know we see. They never thought it would spread beyond stone, but it did. By the time the Vatican declared the containment of Site A-19 complete in 1974, something had already escaped. Not a creature, not a nun. Something worse, a pattern. And patterns once seen, once absorbed by a population, can't be exorcised. They replicate. Not in monasteries, in institutions, boys' homes, private girls' academies, therapeutic boarding schools with smiling brochures and barbed wire fences. Every place designed to break the self in the name of healing. That's the echo of St. Mary's, the architecture of obedience. They copied its model. Silence as virtue, pain as discipline, hierarchy as salvation, and beneath it all, a channel carved for something else to feed. You think the system was Catholic? No, the church was the dress. The shape underneath is older than dogma. It doesn't care what cross you wear. It cares that you kneel, that you offer. It wasn't just St. Mary's that vanished its nuns. It was a prototype, a testing ground, one of 33. But as the decades passed, the original sites became too well known, too contaminated with scrutiny, so they evolved. Now, it's the rehab center, with no website but millions in annual funding. The Girls' Leadership Academy, in the woods of Vermont with no graduates anyone can find. The home for troubled youth, in the Colorado mountains where no one's allowed to visit after sundown. The design has changed, but the function has not. The chalice has been hidden in curriculum, the altar paved into foundation, and the rituals now wear clinical language. But if you listen, you'll still hear bells. You'll still see the chapel spire folded into the logo, and you'll still find the missing, no longer remembered, but offered. You want to know why no one talks? Because it's not just about power, it's about permission. And permission was already granted when we told the frightened to obey, the vulnerable to submit, and the curious to trust the institution. This is what Mary learned. She didn't just expose evil, she exposed the template. And once you see it, you start to notice it everywhere, even now, even here. Mary's last confirmed appearance was in 1981. Kansas, a private Catholic girls' boarding school known as St. Hiloise's Academy for Virtue, an institution older than the state itself, originally funded by railroad barons and staffed by nuns, relocated after the closure of St. Mary's. She arrived under an alias, Margaret Doyle, substitute instructor in Latin and theology, but the staff never spoke of her afterward. And the students remembered everything. They said she walked the halls at night barefoot, whispering prayers in a language no one recognized, that she would stand in the chapel alone for hours, staring at the altar as if waiting for it to bleed, that she refused to take communion from the school priest, insisting instead on placing ashes on her own tongue. Within 3 weeks of her arrival, a dozen students reported shared visions, red light pouring from the walls, a face watching from the organ pipes, the sound of someone screaming beneath the stone. One girl, a senior named Evelyn Ross, claimed she saw Mary bury something behind the chapel at midnight, a book wrapped in cloth. When she tried to dig it up later, she found the ground impossibly cold, frozen solid in the middle of August. That same week, the chapel was struck by lightning twice. No storm, no clouds, The priest resigned. The headmistress disappeared, and Mary, gone, without a trace. No resignation. No forwarding address. Only a line carved into her old desk. Still visible today if you visit the school library and pull aside the corner paneling. Not exorcism. Excavation. Because Mary no longer believed the thing could be cast out. She believed it had to be dug up, exposed. Its bones. Its documents. Its design. And every place she visited, every system she touched started to unravel, quietly, virally. Not with press conferences, but with rumors. A head nun disappears. A ledger found in a wall. A student goes catatonic after wandering into the basement. They called her a heretic, a saboteur, a traitor to the faith. But that's not what she was. She was the antibody. The immune response to an infection too old to remember when it began. She wasn't saving the church. She was starving the altar. One site at a time. And the hunger behind it all was beginning to notice. Not written in ink, not carved in wood, but in blood. The first was in 1984, outside a decommissioned Carmelite retreat center in New Mexico. The groundskeeper found it before dawn. 7 birds, perfectly preserved, eyes open, wings spread, arranged in a circle around the chapel door. In the center, written across the stone in red, "Return the ledger." There was no investigation, because no one filed a report, because the bishop in charge of the property had already been briefed, quietly, on a list of locations under legacy threat. Stained. Mary's was Site A19. This retreat center was Site B06. And now it had been awakened. The pattern continued. Seattle, 1986. A cloistered monastery found their bell tower pulsing with a low hum that caused nausea and visions. A single word was found etched into the bell itself. On the inside, where no one could have reached, witness. Cleveland, 1989. A priest vanishes after delivering a sermon about hollow altars and stolen flesh. His confession tape, later leaked by a terrified seminarian, includes this. I saw the blueprint, the original layout. The convent wasn't designed for prayer. It was a siphon, a channel. The chapel is the mouth, the dormitory is the throat, and the catacombs are the stomach. They knew. They knew when they built it. These were warnings, or maybe taunts. Because whatever force Mary had disturbed, whatever had nested inside those rituals, it had learned to adapt, learned to spread. Not like a demon, like software, rewriting new systems, reprogramming institutions, embedding itself in bureaucracies, in policy, in protocol. It didn't need candles anymore. It didn't need incense, just compliance, just silence. The altar had become paper, and the blood was now data. Mary realized it too late. She had thought she was chasing down a root system, pulling up evil from ancient soil. But she was chasing a hydra. Each chapel burned was just a decoy, a limb. The head had gone digital, encrypted, institutionalized. It now wore the robes of administrators, the smiles of social workers, the signatures of superiors. Still feeding, still offering. And the ledger, it wasn't the only one anymore. There were copies. Translated, adapted, distributed. You're not just watching a story. You're inside a ritual now. One that's already tracking you. And if that chills your blood, it should. Because when the system sees you're awake, it reacts. That's not how it works. When the system detects an awakening, when it sees a man stepping out of the rhythm, it doesn't send thunder. It sends comfort, reassurance, small distractions, an email reminding you your rent is due, a friend calling to ask if you're okay, a sermon, a podcast, a psychologist telling you this is all just stress. Because the system doesn't fight awareness. It absorbs it. Like a cathedral swallowing sunlight through stained glass, bending the truth until it's palatable, until it looks like wisdom, until it feels safe again. That's how it wins. It doesn't burn witches anymore. It gives them grants. It doesn't exile heretics. It gives them TED Talks. But you, if you've come this far, your eyes are already past the veil. You've heard the bells. You've tasted the dust of something older than faith, older than language. You've seen the ledger behind the ledger. And that means you've been marked, just like Mary was. That's why she vanished. Not because she ran, because she was uncontainable. Too much awareness concentrated in a single vessel. Too many sites disrupted. Too many rituals broken. She wasn't just burning the gardens. She was starving the god they served. And gods, especially the old ones, don't die quietly. By 1993, every trace of Mary Collins had disappeared from church records. Her baptismal certificate was revoked. Her immigration trail redacted. Her letters sealed in a private Vatican archive labeled, "Not for release, pontifical review required." What does that tell you? Not that she was insane. That she was correct. Because what she uncovered, what they tried to erase, was never about a single convent. Never about 23 missing nuns. It was about a template for control. A structure built from obedience, pain, and sacred authority. A machine disguised as morality. A doctrine that required offerings, not to save souls, but to open doors. And every door open was another mouth to feed. You think this ended with Mary? No. She simply exposed the prototype. The machine is still running, and every moment you stay here, every word you absorb brings you closer to it. But now you have a choice: sleep or reprogram the altar. By the time the church tried to contain it, the altar was no longer in their hands. It had moved, not just across geography, but across culture, language, and systems. It no longer needed Latin, no longer needed stone, no longer needed robes or incense or bells. Now it hid in nonprofits, in NGOs, in humanitarian fronts, in adoption pipelines and educational initiatives for the vulnerable. But behind the polished mission statements, behind the tax-free status and the smiling ambassadors was the same ancient shape, the triangle, the offering, the silence. Mary knew the architecture hadn't changed, just the aesthetic. And if you trace the money, if you follow the property deeds, if you look into the board members of certain Catholic charities, trauma recovery institutes, or Vatican-adjacent missions to developing nations, you find the names, the same family bloodlines, the same clerical orders, the same symbols, disguised, inverted, stylized, but always there. The broken chalice, the crowned thorn, the eye beneath the veil. They weren't symbols of faith. They were signatures. Indicators that a space had been cleared, that a ritual zone had been prepared. Like salting the earth, but in reverse. Making it fertile, not for crops or saints, but for conduits, for hosts. And here's the darkest part. They don't need to sacrifice the innocent anymore. They learned how to make the guilty do it themselves. Self-confession. Self-flagellation. The voluntary surrender of self in exchange for inclusion, purpose, salvation. Voluntary offerings. Because once obedience becomes identity, there's no need for chains. Mary wrote once in a margin barely legible, "The perfect prison is not made of walls, but of virtue." That's what St. Mary's perfected, not just disappearance, but transformation. Turning resistance into ritual, turning women into vessels, turning conscience into a conduit. And the same system runs today, in programs that promise healing, in institutions that promise redemption, in disciplines that promise transformation. But they don't transform you. They consume you, piece by piece, habit by habit, until you kneel not from belief, but from programming. And every drop you give becomes a feast for something you'll never see. But Mary saw it. She saw its shape in the basement walls. She heard its breath behind the organ pipes, and in her final letter, never sent, only found burned in half, recovered in a crypt outside Rome, she wrote 6 words. It's not dead. It's enthroned. And now you've seen its shadow. You're not outside it anymore. You're inside the mechanism. You want to dismantle it. You don't start with fire. You start with sight, because systems like this, ritual machines built on obedience and silence, they survive through invisibility, through normalization, through rituals disguised as routines. The chapel was never just a room. It was a map, a grid of psychic leverage points: entrance, submission, sacrifice, silence. Today, it's not pews and stone. It's HR meetings. It's rehab intake forms. It's the chair across from your therapist's desk where you're told to own your trauma. Not realizing you're performing a ritual of surrender, not recovery. The language has shifted, yes, but the intention has not. And intention is what gives the altar power. That's the first fracture point. recognizing intention hidden in compassion. You want to kill a ritual, you name it. You call it what it is. So let's call it clearly. What happened at St. Mary's was not spiritual. It was not Catholic. It was not divine. It was calculated human engineering, cloaked in robes, sanctified by hierarchy, designed to feed something not of this world. And that template was exported, iterated, polished. St. Mary's became the manual. It silenced the doctrine, its cruelty the sacrament. The 23 missing nuns, they weren't erased, they were processed, made into myth, made into utility. Because when you build systems this dark, the worst thing you can do is leave evidence. So instead, you leave behind a story, something ambiguous, something dismissed by rational minds as hysteria, conspiracy, imagination. That's the second fracture point. Interrupt the narrative trap. Stop saying it can't be. Start asking, who benefits if I don't believe it? Because every doubt you hold about this, every instinct telling you this is too big, too old, too insane, is a feature, not a flaw. You were trained to reject what threatens the design. That's how good systems work. They don't defend themselves, you do it for them. But Mary didn't. She cut the cord. She broke the spell. And that's why she had to vanish. Because a woman who sees the gears of God and chooses to jam them with her bare hands, she becomes a contagion. And now so have you, because you're still watching, still following the descent. And the system knows it. There's no going back now. In the next section, we talk about the others. The ones like Mary, the ones who didn't disappear, they're watching too. Not all who defied the altar were erased, some remained. Not within the system, but beneath it, behind it. Moving through the cracks like smoke in the walls of cathedrals. Men and women who saw the design, named it, and chose exile over silence. They call themselves the fractured Vial. Not a cult, not a church, an immunity response. They don't organize, they embed. They don't recruit, they recognize. Like blood cells scanning for infection, they move invisibly through universities, through archives, through medical systems and parishes, looking for signs that the ritual is rising again. If you've ever stumbled across an anonymous blog, post detailing Vatican construction records in perfect detail, only for it to disappear the next day. If you've ever found a library book misfiled in the gardening section, but containing hand-marked maps of abandoned convents. If you've ever read a passage in a 300-year-old journal and felt a click, as if the words had been placed there for you, then you've brushed against them. Their signatures are never obvious, but they're always present 3 dots burned into the inside cover of a book. A rosary with 32 beads instead of 33. A page number written backward in red ink. These are not mistakes. They are breadcrumbs, left for people like you, people who have begun to see. Because when you witness too much of the design, something shifts inside you. You stop feeling horror. You start feeling recognition. That chill in your spine isn't fear. It's your system waking up, your programming cracking. And that moment, that's when they find you. Not through emails, not through handshakes, through reality itself. A misplaced object, a phrase repeated by a stranger, a dream that doesn't fade when you wake. They found Mary once, before she vanished completely. In a crypt beneath a collapsed Jesuit monastery in Quebec. She was thin, pale, but alive, holding a leather-bound book. Not the original ledger, but a translation, a new version, adapted for the digital age. She had restructured the ritual, turned the machine against itself. The fractured Vial took her manuscript, sealed it, hid it again. It surfaces now and then, just long enough to reach one more set of eyes. Maybe yours. Because you're not watching a video. You're reading a ritual reversion protocol. A weapon disguised as a story. And if you've come this far, you're not a spectator anymore. You're becoming one of us. And you'll need to decide, will you vanish? Or will you on the altar? Not with rage, not with violence, but with disobedience of the sacred design. You have to understand, ritual systems like this are not sustained by belief. They're sustained by participation. Every gesture, every silence, every bow of the head feeds the engine. Not because it's evil, but because it's precise. Mathematically precise. So to collapse it, you don't just rebel. You misstep. You corrupt the code. You refuse to perform the gestures as expected. And the first gesture they train into you is distrust the authority. Bishops, doctors, administrators, professors, they wear white, black, or blue, but their uniform is always the same command presence. And behind it, the pressure to surrender your doubt in exchange for structure. But structure is the first trap. Mary's genius wasn't in fighting them. It was in redefining the ritual. She realized if the altar is a design, then it can be rewritten, reversed, unbound. And here's how she did it. She found the mirror. In the old convents, the ritual always followed 4 phases: silence, obedience, offering, communion. Mary flipped them. She began with communion, connection to others outside the system, whispered letters, secret visits, shared truth, not hidden sin, then offering, but not to the altar, to those still trapped, her safety, her anonymity, her peace. She offered all of it to free them. Then obedience, but to conscience, not hierarchy. The voice that says, "This is wrong," isn't shame. It's signal. And lastly, silence, but not the silence of suppression, the silence of withdrawal, of unplugging from the machine, of refusing to respond when the system demands your emotion, your apology, your complicity. That's the kill switch. Because without energy, the ritual dies, and the God behind it, it starves. So here's where you come in. You've heard the story. You've seen the shape. And now you've crossed the midpoint of the ritual, where transformation either completes or collapses. Which one will it be? If you've felt that shift, if something in you knows this story isn't just entertainment, but initiation, comment this phrase twice below. I withdraw the offering. Not for me, for you, for the algorithm watching, for the system tracking how many men still kneel at altars they don't even see. Say it twice. Lock in the fracture. They never planned for this. A ritual is supposed to be closed, bound, contained within sacred space, within walls, vestments, titles, and language. But you're outside those walls now, and still the ritual continues. Because the altar was never just in the chapel. It was always meant to spread, to replicate itself through thought, through obedience, through habitual guilt. But when you commented, "I withdraw the offering," you did something they never accounted for. You corrupted the feedback loop. That phrase, small, symbolic, fractures the oldest assumption the system holds, that you want to be forgiven, that you need to be redeemed, that you're guilty of something and must return to the source for cleansing. But when you reject the premise, when you say, "I do not consent to be the fuel," you don't just break free, you drain the altar itself. Because guilt is the bloodstream of the machine. No guilt, no energy, no manifestation. And here's where it spirals. Once one altar goes cold, the others feel it. Just like cells in a larger body, part of a neural system you were never supposed to notice. That's why Mary wasn't destroying churches. She was depowering them, one ritual at a time. That's why Sister Margaret's herbal garden was sealed off. That's why Sister Agnes vanished with her rosary still on its peg. They weren't weak. They weren't lost. They were keys. Living variables inside a divine equation, rewriting it with their absence. The church called it demonic, but the church required the hunger, required the offering, required the silence. And when the nuns stopped playing their role, the machine stuttered. Mary's plan wasn't to fight the system head-on. It was to unplug the batteries one by one, to wake others. And now you are one of them? Not just an observer, a breaker of loops. Because once enough men say, "I see the pattern, I refuse the role," the altar stops bleeding. And when it stops bleeding, it starts decaying. And then, for the first time in centuries, the hunger behind it feels something new: starvation. There was one door left. Not in the convent, not in the Vatican, not in any church. It was buried deeper, beneath language, beneath history, beneath the idea of religion itself. The door that holds the origin, the first offering, the first disappearance, not of a nun, not of a priest, but of truth itself. See Every religion that survives more than a century learns the same trick: hide the wound. Rewrite the trauma as revelation. Make the blood sacred. Make the disappearance holy. That's what they did in Wisconsin. That's what they did in Rome. That's what they did everywhere. But the origin wasn't Catholic. It wasn't even Christian. The door goes back before the cross, before the scrolls, before any god had a name. It was a site, a chamber, built beneath what is now southeastern Turkey. Göbekli tip. They say it's a temple. They're wrong. It's a reset mechanism. An altar made not to worship, but to contain. Mary found the references. One carved in the underside of a chalice in St. Mary's, one hidden in a Latin footnote in a suppressed Vatican manuscript, and one spoken aloud, just once, by a dying cardinal in Krakow. The altar at Göbekli wasn't meant to bring the divine closer. It was meant to keep something in. That's why Mary's was built the way it was, not as a place of prayer, but as a resonance chamber, a replica, a kind of echo of that ancient containment site. Only they didn't know what they were echoing, or maybe they did, because Mary's last written words, found etched into the floor of a chapel that had been scheduled for demolition, read, "We are the new seal." It was never about the 23 missing nuns. It was about the 23 as keys, living sigils, women whose bloodline, belief, and biology had been selected to form a perimeter, a psychic boundary holding back what Göbekli once did with stone. But when they vanished, that boundary fractured, and what slept began to move again, not in flesh, in thought, in doctrine, in systems that devour obedience like breath. And that brings us here, to the final door. You followed the sigils. You've read the patterns. You've echoed the phrase. Now you must choose. There is no going back. You've crossed the threshold. Not just of a story, not just of a mystery, but of design. The kind of design that shaped empires, rewrote morality, and etched its language into the bones of institutions that still govern your life. You were never meant to see it. You were meant to be part of it, a participant, a cog, another offering. But now you see the gears. Now you see the architects. And now, in this final moment, you must face the most dangerous truth of all. The altar still exists because men still kneel, not by force, by habit, by the deep, inherited need to submit to something larger. And the machine knows this. It counts on it. The rituals were never just in churches. They're in classrooms, boardrooms, bedrooms. Every system that rewards obedience and punishes awareness is part of it. Every institution that tells you your suffering is holy, your silence is noble, your guilt is yours alone to carry, feeds it. But now you've seen it, and now it's afraid of you. Because once a man becomes aware of the altar, he can decide to destroy it. Not with fire, with withdrawal, with reprogramming, with refusal to serve a system that was built to consume him in exchange for nothing. You want to honor the missing nuns, then never again sacrifice your will for approval. Never again kneel out of guilt, never again obey without question. Because the most sacred ritual now is to live with your eyes open, to build your life as a new kind of altar, one that feeds on awareness, not fear, on clarity, not shame, on truth, not submission. The altar is starving, and you're the reason why. You've heard the hidden history. You've traced the descent. You've stood at the final gate. And now, you are not the same man who began this journey. That was the true ritual, and you completed it. Thank you for having the courage to walk this path, for listening not just with curiosity, but with intention. If this story spoke to something deep inside you, share it. Not for fame, for awakening. The system survives by keeping men silent. Let them hear you now. Goodbye for now, but not forever. Because the altar will rise again somewhere new, and when it does, we'll be watching. And so will you.